Chapter 1. The Quiet, Muddy Patience of Aztec Chinampas. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that moves very slowly, something damp, something green, something that absolutely refuses to be rushed. So if you can, dim the lights a little, get comfortable, and let your brain clock out for the evening. We're drifting back to the lakes of central Mexico, where people solved the problem of feeding an empire by doing the exact opposite of making noise about it. This is the boring history of sleep, and tonight we're talking about why Aztec Chinampa gardens needed constant, quiet canoe work, and why shouting at them would not have helped at all. Now, before we even touch a canoe paddle, it helps to remember that the Aztecs built their capital city, Tenochtitlan, in the middle of a lake, because of course they did. Dry land was apparently too straightforward. Instead, they chose Lake Texcoco, a shallow, brackish body of water, ringed by mountains, prone to flooding, and absolutely uninterested in cooperating with large-scale agriculture. This did not stop anyone. It just encouraged creativity and a lot of slow, repetitive labor performed while kneeling. The Chinampa system is often described as floating gardens, which is charming, poetic, and completely wrong. They did not float. They were rectangular plots of built-up soil anchored firmly to the lake bed, separated by narrow canals. Think of them less as drifting islands and more as very organized mud sandwiches. Layers of lake sediment, decaying vegetation, reeds, and topsoil were stacked and compressed until they formed long, fertile strips of land. These strips were held in place by willow trees planted at the corners, their roots knitting everything together like living rebar. And once built, these gardens demanded attention, constant attention, not dramatic attention, not heroic attention, just endless, quiet maintenance, the kind that does not look impressive in paintings, the kind that requires you to move slowly so you do not undo your own work. Chinampas worked because the canals around them were calm. The water was shallow and mostly still. Canoes glided through narrow channels, carrying people, tools, compost, seedlings, and occasionally someone's lunch. The entire system depended on balance. If you churned the water too much, you eroded the edges. If you slammed paddles around like you were late for something, you stirred up sediment that clogged roots and buried young plants. The gardens wanted patience. They wanted gentleness. They wanted you to stop splashing. So daily life on a Chinampa was quiet by necessity. Farmers moved in dugout canoes, using smooth, practiced strokes. Paddles entered the water softly, pushed, and lifted without drama. There was no reason to rush. Crops like maize, beans, squash, chilies, tomatoes, and amaranth grew steadily. The soil was so fertile it could support multiple harvests a year, as long as you did not panic and ruin it. And panic, as a rule, was discouraged. The Aztec elite, lounging in palaces back in Tenochtitlan, liked to imagine abundance as something that simply arrived. Canoes full of food gliding silently toward markets. No noise, no fuss. Just produce appearing on schedule. This illusion required an enormous amount of quiet labor by people who were very aware that one careless movement could collapse a canal wall they had spent weeks reinforcing. The canals themselves needed constant dredging. Silt built up naturally. Leaves fell. Algae grew. So farmers scooped sediment from the canal bottoms and spread it back onto the Chinampa beds. This was not glamorous work. It was muddy, repetitive, and best done slowly. Fast movements stirred the water and made everything harder to see. Quiet work kept the water clear enough to judge depth, firmness, and plant health.
There is a reason archaeologists find Chinampa landscapes marked by regularity rather than chaos. These were not experimental gardens. These were systems refined over generations. Everyone knew the rhythm: when to plant, when to dredge, when to reinforce canal edges with reeds, when to stop and let things settle. And settle they did. Water calmed, sediment sank, plants grew. The entire thing functioned like a living machine powered by boredom and restraint. Now, the Aztecs themselves were not particularly chill people in every context. This was a society that enjoyed ritual, spectacle, and the occasional public intensity. But agriculture was not the place for theatrics. Chinampas punished impatience. You could not yell crops into growing faster. You could not stomp around without consequences. The lake noticed everything. Children learned this early. Helping adults in canoes, they were taught how to balance weight, how to place tools, how to move without tipping. A sudden shift could dump compost into the canal. A careless step could collapse a corner. So movement became deliberate, controlled, almost meditative. It's worth lingering on that idea because Chinampa work created a very specific kind of daily mindset. You woke early, you moved quietly, you repeated tasks you had done hundreds of times before. The reward was not excitement, but continuity. Food kept coming. The city kept eating. No one noticed you unless something went wrong. And that was exactly the goal. The canals also acted as temperature regulators. Water absorbed heat during the day and released it at night, protecting crops from frost. This delicate balance depended on calm surfaces. Too much disturbance reduced that effect. So again, quiet mattered, not philosophically, practically. Even transport followed this rule. Canoes carrying produce to market did not race, they drifted. Narrow canals meant passing required coordination. Someone slowed, someone waited. There was no room for ego, only reeds, water, and a schedule set by daylight. Meanwhile, the rulers of the Aztec Empire, men with elaborate titles, feathered headdresses, and strong opinions about tribute, illicitly relied on this system while thinking about it very little, which is the dream, really, to benefit from someone else's calm persistence while focusing on ceremonies and politics. Moctezuma II, for example, famously maintained elaborate gardens and zoological collections, enjoying rare plants and animals delivered from across the empire. These luxuries existed because Chinampa farmers quietly kept producing surplus. No surplus, no royal garden tours, no emperor admiring flowers while ignoring the mud beneath them. Of course, the Chinampa system also required social discipline. Canals crossed property boundaries. Water moved freely. One person's negligence could affect neighbors, so maintenance was communal. Responsibilities were shared. Schedules were agreed upon. This was not a place for lone geniuses. It was a place for people who showed up, did their part, and did not rock the canoe, literally. Noise, in this context, was more than sound. It was disruption, sudden movements, reckless behavior, anything that broke the slow, stable flow of daily work. The Chinampas rewarded predictability. They punished drama. And this may be why they lasted so long. Chinampa agriculture existed before the Aztecs and continued after them. It survived political collapse, conquest, and demographic catastrophe. The system itself did not care who was in charge, as long as someone showed up, quietly paddled, and kept on, while empires came and went above them.
There is something almost insulting about how effective they were. No wheels, no beasts of burden, no metal tools, just mud, water, plants, and people who understood that calm effort beats frantic innovation every time. And so, as we drift along these narrow canals, it becomes clear why quiet canoe work was not a preference but a requirement. Chinampas were not fragile exactly, they were resilient, but only when treated gently. They asked for consistency, not enthusiasm. Tomorrow, you could skip a day, and things would be fine. Rush for an hour, and you might undo weeks of labor. The lake remembered everything. So the farmers learned to move like the water itself, slow, predictable, patient. Their work was never meant to be impressive, it was meant to continue. By the time a Chinampa reached full productivity, it had already absorbed years of quiet habit. Not innovation, not breakthroughs, just repetition. The same canal edges checked again and again, the same soft landings of paddles into water that had seen thousands before. This is where the system really settled into its personality, which was deeply unbothered by urgency. A typical workday began before the lake had fully decided what color it wanted to be. Farmers slid canoes into the water without ceremony. No shouting across canals, no dramatic greetings. Sound traveled easily across the flat surface, and no one needed it echoing around. Everyone already knew where they were going. Everyone already knew what needed doing. The first task was usually inspection. Chinampas were living structures, and they shifted. Canal walls sagged, roots loosened. A reed cluster might lean a little too far. These were not emergencies, they were notes, things to be addressed slowly, with hands and tools and patience. You pressed the soil back, you added organic matter, you let the water settle again before moving on. Water clarity mattered more than speed. Clear water let you see submerged roots, collapsed edges, or floating debris before it became a problem. Stirring everything up in a hurry only hid issues, so people learned to pause between movements, paddle, glide, wait, reach down, adjust, wait again. This rhythm became muscle memory. Children absorbed it by watching. They learned that sudden movements were corrected instantly, usually with a sharp look rather than words. You didn't need a lecture. The canoe wobble was lesson enough. One awkward splash, and you understood why everyone else moved the way they did. Chinampa farming also required constant hauling, which sounds like an argument for speed, but absolutely wasn't. Mud, vegetation, and compost were heavy and unstable. Load too much, move too fast, and you tipped. So cargo was balanced carefully, weight distributed evenly. Canoes were loaded low, gliding inches above the waterline, as if embarrassed to draw attention to themselves. The compost itself came from the lake. Aquatic plants, algae, and dredged sediment were lifted, drained, and layered onto the beds. This process looked slow because it had to be. Wet organic matter shifted as it dried. Dump it too fast, and it slid off the edge, right back into the canal. So it was placed in stages. Spread thin, let it settle, come back later. None of this encouraged hurry. The Chinampa system trained people out of impatience. There was no payoff for finishing early. There was only the quiet satisfaction of leaving things stable when you were done. Markets in Tenochtitlan thrived on this stability. Canoes arrived steadily, not in bursts. Produce was fresh because harvests were constant. This consistency fed hundreds of thousands of people without spectacle. The empire ran on predictable vegetables, not heroic harvest days. The elite noticed the results, but rarely the process. Tribute lists recorded quantities of food, flowers, and herbs delivered to palaces and temples. They did not mention how many hours someone spent repacking canal edges after a minor collapse caused by a careless turn. That work was invisible by design. And invisibility, in this case, was success. There was also an emotional economy at work. Chinampa farming did not reward anxiety. Worrying did nothing. If a storm damaged a canal wall, you repaired it. If a crop failed, you replanted. The system allowed for recovery as long as people stayed calm and kept moving. Contrast this with dry land farming, where drought or frost could wipe out an entire season in dramatic fashion. Chinampas buffered risk, water moderated temperature, nutrients recycled endlessly. This reduced panic, reduced the temptation to gamble everything in one frantic effort. Even rituals tied to agriculture reflected this steadiness. Offerings were made, calendars were followed, but the daily work did not pause for theatrics. The lake did not care about symbolism, it cared about balance. Spanish chroniclers later struggled to describe this world accurately. They admired the productivity, but often missed the point. They wrote about abundance as if it were magic, as if gardens simply existed because the land was generous. They rarely grasped that generosity was engineered through restraint. When colonial authorities tried to alter or drain the lakes, the Chinampa system suffered. Water levels changed too fast. Canals dried or flooded unpredictably. Quiet routines were replaced with disruptive interventions. The land responded badly. Yields dropped. The lake, once cooperative, became difficult. This is a recurring human theme. See a calm system, decide it must be inefficient, interfere, act surprised when it breaks. Yet, Chinampas endured anyway. In places like Xochimilco, they still exist, clinging stubbornly to their original logic. Tourists float through canals now, often loudly, often unaware that beneath the decorations and music is a landscape built for silence. The gardens tolerate it for now, but they still prefer the old ways. At their core, Chinampas represent a rare agricultural philosophy. Do less, but do it constantly. Don't rush, don't dominate, just participate. This is why quiet canoe work wasn't optional. It was the operating system. Noise meant disruption. Disruption meant erosion. Erosion meant hunger. The connection was direct and very boring. And boring in this context was life-saving. As the empire expanded, tribute demands increased. More mouths to feed, more expectations placed on these calm, rectangular plots of land. The response was not to rush harder, it was to build more Chinampas, extend the grid, repeat the same pattern somewhere else. Same width, same canals, same slow movements. Innovation came in refinement, not reinvention. Better planting schedules, improved compost layering, slight adjustments to canal depth. All small, all incremental, all deeply unexciting, which is why it worked.
Chapter 3: How an Empire Learned to Move at the Speed of a Canoe. Once a society organizes its food supply around calm, repetitive labor, that calm has a way of leaking into everything else. Not completely, of course. This was still the Aztec world, not a lakeside yoga retreat. But the Chinampa rhythm shaped daily life in ways that are easy to miss if you only focus on wars, rulers, and dramatic endings. Most people in the basin of Mexico lived close enough to Chinampa zones to feel their influence. Even those who never set foot in a canoe depended on the steady flow of food they produced. Markets functioned with remarkable regularity. Prices stayed relatively stable. Famines were rare compared to other pre-modern societies. When shortages happened, they tended to come from political disruption, not agricultural collapse. This predictability created a strange contrast. On one hand, you had an elite culture obsessed with omens, calendars, and cosmic instability. On the other, you had a food system that quietly refused to panic. The universe might be fragile, but the lettuce would still show up. Households organized their time around this steadiness. Meals were predictable, ingredients familiar. There was comfort in knowing what tomorrow would look like, at least at the table. That kind of background stability allowed people to tolerate a lot of other nonsense, including heavy tribute demands and ambitious rulers. For the nobility, Chinampas became symbols of refinement rather than labor. Elite estates sometimes included ornamental gardens inspired by Chinampa techniques, carefully managed by workers who understood that beauty still required quiet maintenance. Water features had to remain calm. Plants had to be tended without disturbing symmetry. Even luxury copied restraint.
Rulers liked to present themselves as providers, but in reality, they were curators of systems they did not fully control. The Chinampas predated them, outlasted many of them. The land did not care about dynasties. It responded only to continued attention. This was uncomfortable knowledge for a political culture that valued spectacle. Temples rose dramatically, rituals unfolded publicly, victories were celebrated loudly. Meanwhile, the most important work happened low to the water, unnoticed, and ideally unheard. There's an irony here that the Aztecs themselves probably understood on some level. Their myths often emphasized cycles, balance, and repetition. The Chinampas embodied those ideas better than any ceremony. They were mythology turned into mud. Children raised near Chinampa zones internalized these lessons early. They learned to read water surfaces, plant health, and soil texture with the same attentiveness others might reserve for omens. A slight discoloration meant nutrients were off. A leaning reed suggested erosion starting below the surface. These signs were subtle. They rewarded observation, not reaction. This kind of knowledge did not translate easily into status. You couldn't display it in a procession. You couldn't carve it into stone. It lived in habits, which made it vulnerable to being underestimated. As the empire expanded, administrators sometimes pushed for increased output without understanding limits. More tribute, more land converted, more expectations. The response from Chinampa farmers was not rebellion, but careful negotiation with reality. There was only so much you could do without destabilizing the system. And so expansion happened laterally. More plots, more canals, more quiet labor, not more intensity per square meter. That would have been counterproductive. This logic also influenced conflict management. In Chinampa regions, disputes over land or water were serious, but handled with caution. A damaged canal hurt everyone. Even rivals understood that escalation had consequences. Quiet agreements were preferable to loud victories. That doesn't mean peace reigned everywhere. It means certain areas developed a shared interest in calm, a collective understanding that some things were too important to disrupt. When the Spanish arrived, this cultural emphasis was invisible to them. They saw canals and gardens, but they did not see the social contracts embedded in them. They interpreted quiet as passivity, patience as simplicity. They assumed systems could be altered quickly to suit new goals. This misunderstanding would matter later. In the short term, though, Chinampas impressed. They fed invading forces, supplied colonial cities. Spanish settlers enjoyed the abundance while assuming it would continue automatically. They rarely asked what sustained it. Colonial policies eventually shifted land ownership and labor patterns. Water levels were altered, canals neglected. The old rhythm was broken in places, and yields declined, slowly, predictably, and without drama. Just less food, less stability, more strain. This was not a sudden collapse, it was attrition. A system built for quiet continuity responded to disruption by gradually ceasing to function. But in areas where traditions persisted, Chinampas adapted. New crops were introduced, techniques adjusted. The core principle remained: don't rush, don't overwhelm the water, let things settle. This persistence is perhaps the most boring and impressive thing about them. Empires fell, belief systems shifted, languages changed. The Chinampas kept doing the same thing. Even today, researchers studying sustainable agriculture point to Chinampas as models: high yield, low input, minimal waste, built-in resilience, all achieved without noise or urgency. The lesson is obvious and consistently ignored. Modern life struggles with this idea. We equate speed with efficiency, activity with progress. Chinampas quietly contradict that worldview. They say you can accomplish a great deal by doing very little, as long as you do it every day. For the Aztecs, this created a strange dual identity, a people capable of intense ritual drama, supported by an agricultural system that demanded emotional restraint, fire and water, noise and silence, ceremony and routine. The Chinampas were not glamorous. They did not inspire epic poetry, but they underwrote everything else. Without them, the temples would have been empty stages. And this is perhaps why they are so rarely centered in popular history. They lack narrative spikes. There is no moment where everything changes, no single hero, just continuity. But continuity is what allowed everything else to exist. So when we imagine those narrow canals, those careful paddle strokes, those workers pausing to let sediment sink, we're seeing the true tempo of the Aztec world, not the drumbeat of ceremony, not the clash of conquest, but the soft dip of wood into water, repeated until it becomes background noise, or rather, the absence of noise altogether.
Chapter 4. Feeding spectacle without becoming it. Tenochtitlan was not a quiet city. That's important to say up front. This was a place of drums, chanting, markets buzzing from dawn to dusk, and ceremonial spaces designed to impress gods who were famously hard to please. And yet, all of that noise sat on top of a food system that functioned best when no one raised their voice. Every morning, long before ceremonies began, canoes slipped toward the city carrying produce harvested just hours earlier. Flowers for rituals, greens for households, maize for grinding, chilies for flavor and mild regret. The canals leading into the city were narrow and busy, but still controlled. Traffic moved by convention, not enforcement. You yielded because chaos would slow everyone down, including you. The city's markets, especially the enormous one at Tlatelolco, depended entirely on this flow. Spanish observers later marveled at the organization, the order, the sheer volume of goods. What they didn't always notice was how fragile that order would have been if the upstream routines changed. The market looked energetic because everything before it was not. Merchants could shout prices all day because someone else had already done the quiet work. Priests could stage elaborate rituals because food showed up reliably. Warriors could train and campaign because they weren't worried about the next harvest. Chinampas made ambition possible by removing uncertainty. This created an odd social imbalance. The loudest, most visible roles in Aztec society were also the least involved in the system keeping them alive. Elites understood Chinampas abstractly, as resources, not as processes. They knew tribute quotas, not maintenance schedules. This distance mattered. When rulers pushed for expansion, they thought in terms of land and labor, not water behavior. They assumed more control meant more output. Chinampa farmers knew better, but their knowledge didn't translate well into imperial language. So they complied quietly. They extended systems carefully. They avoided shortcuts. When demands exceeded what was reasonable, the system absorbed the strain for a while. Quiet systems are very good at masking stress until they aren't. Within the city, Chinampa produce shaped daily habits. Meals were repetitive but reliable. Tortillas, beans, squash, greens. Seasonal variations kept things from becoming too dull, but predictability was the point. Food was fuel, not spectacle. Spectacle came later. This separation between sustenance and show allowed Aztec society to maintain intense ritual cycles without destabilizing daily life. Even when ceremonies required large amounts of food for offerings or feasts, the Chinampas adjusted without drama. They were designed to produce surplus steadily, not occasionally. It's worth pausing on how rare that is historically. Many societies depended on big harvest moments, followed by long periods of storage and anxiety. Chinampas smoothed time. They flattened the calendar. There was always something growing, something ready, something nearly ready. That temporal smoothing reduced fear, reduced hoarding, reduced desperation. You didn't need to gamble everything on one season. You just needed to keep showing up. Which brings us back to why quiet mattered so much. Loud systems tend to be brittle. They rely on peaks. Chinampas avoided peaks entirely.
They aimed for a gentle plateau that extended indefinitely. Even the city's infrastructure mirrored this logic. Causeways crossed the lake with removable bridges, allowing water flow and defense without permanent disruption. Aqueducts brought fresh water gently without forcing it. Everything worked best when movement was controlled and measured. The irony is that outsiders often remembered the Aztecs for intensity, not restraint. Blood, spectacle, cosmic anxiety. But beneath that was an everyday life shaped by moderation and routine. The Chinampas anchored that contradiction. When Spanish forces laid siege to Tenochtitlan, they targeted the canals. They understood, at least intuitively, that cutting off food would do what force alone could not. Canoes were blocked, Chinampas were damaged, the quiet system was disrupted loudly. And once disrupted, it struggled, not because it was weak, but because it was not designed for chaos. War is loud, Chinampas are not. The mismatch was devastating. After the conquest, colonial authorities drained parts of the lake to prevent flooding and assert control. In doing so, they dismantled the environmental conditions that made Chinampas thrive. This wasn't immediate. It happened gradually. Water receded, soil dried, canals lost depth. The system didn't collapse overnight. It just became harder, less forgiving, more labor for less yield. Still, Chinampas persisted where they could, because they had always been about adaptation without panic. Farmers adjusted canal widths, altered crops, reinforced edges differently. They didn't abandon the logic, they refined it. Modern observers sometimes romanticize this resilience, but it came at a cost. More effort, more vigilance, more quiet problem solving, the kind that never makes headlines. What Chinampas ultimately show us is that sustainability is rarely exciting. It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just keeps working, assuming no one interferes too much. This is deeply uncomfortable for cultures that equate progress with acceleration. Chinampas suggest that slowing down can actually increase output over time, that stability beats growth spurts, that patience is a technology. For the Aztecs, this technology made empire possible. For us, it mostly makes for mildly interesting documentaries and calm nighttime listening. And maybe that's fitting. Chinampas were never meant to be celebrated. They were meant to function, quietly, relentlessly, without applause. As we let the city fade behind us and drift back into the canals, past willows and reeds that have seen centuries of hands repairing the same edges, we can feel the pace drop again. The water smooths, the noise recedes. And in that calm, we're reminded that history is not only shaped by dramatic decisions and powerful individuals. It's shaped by people who mastered the art of not rushing, day after day, while the world above them made as much noise as it wanted. Chapter 5. Maintenance as Destiny and the People Who Never Got Statues. If Chinampas had a single unifying principle, it was maintenance, not innovation, not ambition, just maintenance repeated until it became destiny. This is uncomfortable territory for most historical narratives, which prefer moments over processes and names over habits. Chinampa history offers very few named heroes. It offers a lot of people doing the same thing correctly for decades. A Chinampa was never really finished. Even newly built plots immediately began trying to unmake themselves. Water pressed at the edges, roots expanded, organic matter decomposed. Nothing stayed put unless someone returned to it. So ownership was less about possession and more about obligation. You didn't own a Chinampa so much as agree to keep it from dissolving. This created a quiet social contract. Families passed down not just land, but knowledge of its quirks. Which corner slumped after heavy rain? Which canal filled with silt fastest? Which section needed extra reeds every year? These details were not written down. They lived in memory and routine. Missing a few days wasn't a problem. Missing a season could be. Neglect showed itself subtly at first. Slight narrowing of a canal, water that didn't clear as quickly, plants that leaned instead of standing firm. None of this was dramatic, which made it easy to ignore until it wasn't.
There was very little room for shortcuts. Shortcuts damaged the system and punished the person taking them. Everyone knew this, so resistance took the form of quiet limits. You could only produce so much without destabilizing the land. Beyond that, reality pushed back. This tension between imperial expectation and ecological reality never fully resolved. It just existed, simmering beneath the surface, buffered by the system's resilience. What's striking is how little drama this produced internally. No mass revolts centered on Chinampa labor, no agricultural manifestos, just gradual adjustments and unspoken boundaries. The system trained people to think in long terms, to accept that some outcomes couldn't be rushed into existence. Even family life reflected this mindset. Children were introduced to work early, not through commands, but through participation. You sat in the canoe, you held tools, you watched. Over time, movements slowed, awareness sharpened, mistakes became less frequent. This was education without spectacle. There were no graduation moments, just competence quietly emerging. Gender roles within Chinampa communities were flexible compared to more rigid elite structures. Everyone participated in some form of maintenance, planting, harvesting, or transport. The system did not reward strict division so much as reliability. Whoever showed up and did the work mattered. Ritual life intersected gently with this labor. Offerings were made to agricultural deities, but the gods were not expected to replace effort. Divine favor helped. It did not dredge canals for you. This practical theology kept expectations grounded. In contrast, elite rituals sometimes drifted toward abstraction, grand gestures aimed at cosmic balance. Chinampa work grounded belief in mud and water. It reminded people daily that survival depended on attention, not spectacle. When colonial rule disrupted these communities, it wasn't just land loss that hurt. It was the breaking of maintenance chains. People displaced from Chinampas lost access to land they knew intimately. New owners lacked the knowledge to care for it properly. The land responded accordingly. This pattern repeated across generations. Systems built on quiet expertise suffered when that expertise was undervalued or removed. Yields declined, canals filled, gardens shrank. Not catastrophically, gradually, which made it easier to ignore until recovery became difficult. And yet, where knowledge survived, so did the system, in pockets, in fragments, passed down quietly. Still boring, still effective. Modern agriculture, with its machines and chemicals, often treats maintenance as secondary to production. Chinampas invert that logic. Maintenance is production. Without it, nothing else matters. This is why Chinampa work resisted simplification. You couldn't scale it without scaling care. You couldn't automate attention. You had to be present, physically, mentally, calmly. This requirement limited exploitation in subtle ways. You could extract surplus, but only as long as the people maintaining the system were still able to do so properly. Push too hard, and the system degraded. There was no dramatic failure point, just diminishing returns. History rarely lingers on diminishing returns. They're boring. They don't fit neat narratives, but they shape outcomes more reliably than sudden collapses. The Aztec Chinampas shaped an empire by refusing to hurry, by insisting that daily, quiet effort mattered more than occasional intensity. They fed cities, supported elites, enabled spectacle, all while remaining unseen. And the people who kept them functioning never became legends. No songs celebrated their paddle strokes. No monuments marked their dredging schedules. Their success was measured in absence. Absence of famine. Absence of crisis.
absence of noise, which, for something meant to help people sleep, feels appropriate. As we continue drifting along these canals, past plots rebuilt countless times by hands long gone, it becomes clear that Chinampas were not just agricultural technology. They were a worldview, one that accepted that the most important work rarely announces itself. Chapter 6. When quiet systems meet loud ambitions. Every calm system eventually encounters someone who decides it would work better if it were faster. Chinampas were no exception. Their entire history sits beneath a long series of human impulses to intervene, optimize, expand, and generally improve things that were already functioning just fine. Within the Aztec world itself, these impulses were usually restrained by experience. Elders knew what happened when canals were rushed or plots overloaded. There was institutional memory, even if it wasn't written down. People had seen land fail quietly before. That memory acted like a brake. But brakes only work when the driver believes in them. As imperial ambitions grew, rulers increasingly thought in terms of scale rather than balance. More territory meant more mouths to feed, more ceremonies to stage, more warriors to maintain. Chinampas were seen as endlessly expandable, which was true only if you accepted their pace. This distinction mattered. The system could grow sideways, not vertically. You added plots, you extended canals, you trained more people. What you did not do was demand that existing plots work harder. Soil did not respond well to pressure. Water did not respond well to impatience. Most of the time, this difference was respected, if only implicitly. But moments of crisis revealed how fragile that understanding could be. Floods were a recurring issue in the basin of Mexico. Managing water levels required careful coordination of causeways, dikes, and canals. Chinampas depended on stable water height. Too low and they dried. Too high and they drowned. Adjustments had to be gradual. When leadership intervened thoughtfully, things worked. When leadership intervened abruptly, the lake pushed back. Water ignored authority. It followed physics. There were moments when major hydraulic projects disrupted Chinampa zones temporarily. Repairs followed. Lessons were learned, usually. But the margin for error was never large. Loud changes produced quiet consequences that took years to fully appear. This dynamic became far more pronounced after the Spanish conquest, when new ambitions arrived with little interest in old rhythms. Colonial planners looked at lakes and saw obstacles. They looked at canals and saw inefficiency. They looked at Chinampas and saw quaint survivals rather than critical infrastructure. Draining the lake became a long-term obsession. Flood prevention, urban expansion, control. All reasonable goals loudly pursued. But Chinampas required water. Not just any water, specific water, at specific depths, moving slowly. As drainage projects progressed, water tables dropped. Some Chinampas were left stranded. Others experienced unpredictable fluctuations. Maintenance routines that worked for centuries suddenly didn't. The land hadn't changed its rules. The context had. Farmers adapted where they could. They deepened canals, reinforced edges, switched crops. But adaptation had limits. Quiet systems are flexible, but only within parameters. Outside those, they weaken. The tragedy here is not dramatic destruction, it's slow unraveling. A canal that needs dredging twice as often, soil that dries out a little faster, yields that drop just enough to strain households. None of it alarming on its own, together transformative. Colonial authorities often interpreted this decline as proof that indigenous systems were inferior. They missed the role of their own interventions. This misunderstanding justified further changes, which made things worse. A familiar loop.
What makes Chinampas especially interesting is how long they resisted this process. Decades, centuries, even partially damaged systems continued producing.
They absorbed stress quietly. They didn't fail loudly enough to demand attention. Modern infrastructure tends to collapse spectacularly. Bridges fall, dams burst. Chinampas just become less generous. They respond to neglect with subtle refusal. This quality made them easy to overlook. Administrators paid attention to crises, not gradual declines. As long as food arrived, no one asked why it arrived more slowly or in smaller quantities. Meanwhile, the people working the land understood exactly what was happening. They felt the difference in their hands, in how often they needed to repair edges, in how water behaved after storms. Their knowledge grew more valuable as conditions worsened, even as their social status declined. This is another recurring theme in history. Expertise becomes more critical precisely when it is least respected. By the 19th and 20th centuries, Chinampas were framed as remnants of the past, something to be replaced by modern agriculture. Fields, tractors, straight lines, loud efficiency. And yet, modern methods struggled in the same environment. Drained land subsided, soil compacted, chemical inputs became necessary. The supposed improvements required constant intervention to remain productive. Chinampas, in contrast, continued functioning wherever water and knowledge remained. They did not compete well in narratives of progress, but they competed very well in reality. Researchers eventually noticed this. Yields per hectare were astonishing, environmental impact minimal, labor-intensive, yes, but sustainable. Suddenly, the quiet system looked clever again. By then, much had been lost. Urban sprawl replaced canals, pollution entered remaining waterways. The calm conditions Chinampas needed became harder to find. They survived in fragments, surrounded by noise. And yet, even now, their logic remains intact. Where they exist, they still reward patience, they still punish haste, they still require daily attention and offer steady returns. This persistence suggests something uncomfortable about human ambition. Loud systems promise control. Quiet systems offer cooperation. Control feels powerful. Cooperation feels slow. We choose control repeatedly and are surprised when it demands constant correction. Chinampas asked for something else entirely. They asked people to listen, to observe, to respond gently, to accept limits. Not thrilling qualities, not empire-building virtues, at least not in the usual sense. But they built an empire anyway, or at least fed one. When loud ambitions finally overwhelmed them, the loss wasn't immediate hunger or chaos. It was a thinning, a gradual narrowing of options, less resilience, more dependence on external inputs. This is the true cost of ignoring quiet systems. They don't punish you with drama, they punish you with fragility. As we drift along what remains of these canals, past patches of water where gardens once stretched uninterrupted, it's hard not to feel that we are looking at a lesson repeatedly offered and repeatedly declined. Slow down, pay attention, maintain what works. Simple advice, easy to forget. Let's keep moving, gently, toward the later centuries, where Chinampas became symbols of both loss and stubborn survival, quietly insisting that they were never the problem to begin with. Chapter 7. Survival by stubbornness, not nostalgia. By the time Chinampas were being described as relics, they had already proven an unusual talent for outlasting opinions about them. People can stop believing in a system long before it actually stops working. Chinampa spent centuries in that awkward phase, quietly productive, broadly dismissed, and increasingly surrounded by people convinced they knew better. After independence and into the modern era, the basin of Mexico transformed rapidly. Lakes shrank, cities expanded, canals were filled in or paved over, water was redirected, pumped, controlled, and generally treated as something that should move on command. Chinampas, which depended on water behaving politely rather than obediently, were not consulted. And yet, they survived where conditions allowed, not because anyone was sentimental about them, but because they continued to feed people. In areas like Xochimilco, families maintained Chinampas not as cultural artifacts, but as working land. They adapted quietly, as they always had. New crops appeared: lettuce, spinach, flowers grown for urban markets. Techniques adjusted slightly, materials changed, the underlying rhythm did not. Canoes still moved slowly, maintenance still mattered more than speed. The system remained allergic to haste. What changed was the context. Water quality declined, pollution entered canals, urban runoff brought contaminants. Chinampas responded the only way they could, by requiring more effort for the same results. Farmers filtered water with reeds, removed debris manually, adjusted planting cycles. This increased labor did not come with increased recognition. Chinampa farmers became marginal figures in a modernizing city. Their work was tolerated, sometimes celebrated symbolically, but rarely supported structurally. Infrastructure investments favored roads over canals. Development favored straight lines over grids that followed water. The irony here is heavy but quiet. Modern sustainability movements would later rediscover Chinampas as models of ecological balance, praising their efficiency and resilience. Meanwhile, the people still practicing them struggled to survive economically. Research papers admired yields, tourists admired scenery, farmers needed stable water and land rights. This disconnect highlights something Chinampas had always embodied. Systems can be admired without being understood, and understanding, not admiration, is what keeps them alive. Chinampas never needed to be preserved as museums. They needed to be left alone, maintained, and respected as working landscapes. But preservation is loud, maintenance is boring. Guess which one wins? In recent decades, there have been efforts to revive Chinampa agriculture more deliberately. Environmental projects, educational programs, heritage designations. These have helped in some areas, but they often struggle against the same issue Chinampas have always faced: impatience. Funding cycles are short, expectations are high, results are demanded quickly. Chinampas do not rush for grants. They respond on their own schedule. This mismatch creates frustration. Projects declare success or failure within years. Chinampas think in generations. The timeline difference is non-negotiable. And yet, with all of this, Chinampas continue to do what they have always done best: quietly produce food when conditions allow. They don't advertise, they don't scale explosively, they don't pivot, they endure. This endurance is not romantic, it is not dramatic, it is slightly inconvenient. Chinampas refuse to disappear neatly, but they also refuse to become modern success stories. They exist in between, muddy and persistent. That persistence carries a lesson that history keeps offering in increasingly louder voices. Systems built on balance cannot be forced into narratives of speed and dominance without breaking something, sometimes slowly, sometimes permanently.
The Aztecs did not invent Chinampas, but they refined them. They understood their temperament. They knew that the gardens required quiet canoe work, not because silence was sacred, but because physics was unforgiving. That understanding allowed a massive city to exist in the middle of a lake. It allowed ritual, power, and spectacle to flourish without starving the population. It allowed complexity without collapse. When that understanding was lost, the system didn't protest. It just faded, piece by piece. Which brings us, gently, to the end of this particular drift. Chinampas are still there, in fragments, doing what they can. They ask very little: attention, patience, calm hands. They do not demand belief, they reward care. And in a world increasingly built on noise, speed, and interruption,
That might be the most quietly radical thing of all.
Even within Chinampa communities, this calm produced its own kind of pressure. When things are stable, expectations rise. Consistency becomes normal. A slight dip in yield feels significant, even if it's minor by historical standards. Quiet systems raise the bar for what counts as a problem. So farmers watched closely. They noticed when water stayed cloudy longer than usual, when plants matured unevenly, when canal walls needed reinforcement earlier in the season. These were not emergencies, but signals. Chinampa work trained people to respond to signals before they became crises. This preemptive mindset is difficult to maintain in loud cultures. It requires humility. You have to accept that small actions matter and that ignoring them compounds slowly. Chinampas rewarded attention paid early and punished procrastination later, which, again, is not thrilling advice. The system also shaped time perception. Days blurred into routines. Seasons were marked by subtle changes rather than dramatic shifts. There were no frantic harvest weeks followed by long lulls. Instead, there was always something to tend, something to harvest, something to prepare. This continuity made time feel flatter, less punctuated, which is probably one reason Chinampa life doesn't generate dramatic stories. There's no single moment where everything hinges, just thousands of moments where nothing goes wrong. And nothing going wrong is historically invisible. For elites, this invisibility created a false sense of security. As long as food arrived, the system was assumed to be healthy. No one asked how close it was to its limits. Chinampas hid their stress well. They didn't complain, they just required more care. This disconnect between appearance and reality is another reason quiet systems are vulnerable. They don't generate alarms, they generate chores, and chores are easy to postpone. In modern contexts, this pattern repeats endlessly. Infrastructure ages quietly. Ecosystems degrade subtly. Maintenance budgets shrink because nothing has collapsed yet. Chinampas lived this dynamic centuries before we gave it spreadsheets. What's remarkable is how often they still absorbed the neglect. They adapted, they adjusted, they endured. But each adjustment narrowed the margin for error. Each workaround consumed future flexibility. This is how quiet systems fail, not through sudden disaster, but through the exhaustion of options. And yet, Chinampas rarely reached total failure. They persisted in reduced form, sustaining smaller communities even as cities sprawled around them. This partial survival is less dramatic than extinction, but more instructive. It shows that systems can be damaged without being destroyed, that loss is often incremental, that recovery, if it happens at all, requires patience equal to the patience originally invested. For those still working Chinampas today, this long view is unavoidable. They inherit not just land, but accumulated adjustments, layers of adaptation built on previous compromises. The work includes remembering why things are the way they are. This historical depth adds another layer of quiet labor, interpretation, understanding which practices are essential and which are contingent, knowing what can change and what cannot. That knowledge is fragile. It doesn't survive displacement well. When people are removed from land, the logic embedded in routines dissolves. Written descriptions can't fully replace embodied understanding. This is another reason Chinampas struggled under external control. You could take the land, but you couldn't immediately take the knowledge needed to keep it stable. And without that knowledge, the land responded poorly. Throughout all of this, the Chinampas themselves remained uninterested in human narratives. They didn't care about decline or revival. They responded to inputs: water in,
Organic matter added, roots anchored, or not. This indifference is part of their quiet power. They don't argue, they don't negotiate, they don't explain themselves. They just reflect the quality of attention they receive. And that reflection is slow, slow enough that cause and effect blur, slow enough that responsibility is easy to dodge, slow enough that lessons arrive long after the people who caused the problem have moved on, which, again, is not thrilling advice. Chapter 10. Boredom as Infrastructure. By the time you've spent long enough around Chinampas, boredom stops feeling like a failure and starts feeling like a feature. Not the restless kind of boredom that makes you fidget, but the soft, predictable kind that settles in once nothing unexpected happens for a while. Chinampas were built on that kind of boredom. They depended on it. Infrastructure usually announces itself when it breaks. Roads collapse, power grids fail, water stops flowing. Chinampas, by contrast, announced themselves by not requiring attention. If everything was boring, everything was working. This inverted relationship to drama shaped how people understood responsibility. There was no crisis response team for Chinampas. There didn't need to be. Maintenance was the response, and it happened every day, quietly, without escalation. This daily attention made failure unlikely, but also uninteresting. There was no glory in catching a canal edge before it collapsed, no celebration for sediment that settled properly. Success was invisible and therefore easily undervalued. Yet this invisibility made Chinampas incredibly reliable. They didn't rely on rare expertise or specialized tools. They relied on habits. Habits are easier to sustain over generations than instructions. You can forget rules, you can misinterpret texts, but habits persist as long as people keep doing them. This is one reason Chinampas outlived political systems that assumed they would not. Regimes changed, laws shifted, but people still knew how to paddle without splashing, how to place soil without eroding edges, how to wait for water to clear before moving on. These habits were not taught as theory. They were learned through repetition, through mistakes corrected gently, through the quiet embarrassment of tipping a canoe and having to fix it. Embarrassment, it turns out, is a very effective teacher. Boredom also created emotional resilience. When your daily work rarely surprised you, surprises elsewhere were easier to absorb. Crop failures were localized, recoverable. There was no single moment where everything hinged on success. This reduced panic at the societal level. Chinampas didn't eliminate stress, but they dampened it. They acted like shock absorbers for human ambition. This dampening effect is subtle and therefore easy to ignore. It doesn't feel like progress. It feels like nothing happening, and nothing happening rarely gets credit.
Modern systems, by contrast, often depend on constant excitement, innovation cycles, quarterly growth, continuous optimization. These systems burn brightly and then require intervention when they falter. Chinampas burned low and steady. That steady burn made them resistant to ideological shifts. They didn't care if people believed in them. They worked as long as someone did the work. This is why attempts to abolish or replace Chinampas often stalled. You could change policy, you could redirect funding, but as long as water remained and someone tended the land, the gardens continued. They were stubbornly apolitical. At the same time, this apolitical nature made them vulnerable. They did not lobby, they did not demand protection. When conditions worsened beyond their tolerance, they simply produced less. Again, no drama, just reduced capacity. For historians, this presents a challenge. How do you tell the story of something that succeeds by avoiding events? How do you narrate a system whose greatest achievement is continuity? Usually you don't. You mention it in passing, you footnote it, you move on to something louder.
which is why Chinampas often appear in textbooks as curiosities rather than central pillars. Floating gardens, ingenious but peripheral, a neat trick rather than the backbone of an empire. This framing misses the point entirely. Chinampas were not a trick, they were infrastructure, slow, boring, essential infrastructure. And like all good infrastructure, they were designed to fade into the background. Even today, when people encounter functioning Chinampas, they often remark on how peaceful they feel. Calm water, green beds, gentle movement. This reaction isn't accidental. The system was built to minimize disturbance, to absorb motion rather than amplify it. In that sense, Chinampas are architectural as much as agricultural. They shape experience. They slow people down without asking permission. This is probably why they make such effective metaphors, even if no one asked for one. They remind us that stability is constructed, that calm doesn't happen naturally at scale. It has to be maintained. And maintenance, by definition, is boring. The Aztecs didn't celebrate boredom. They didn't write hymns to routine, but they built a society that depended on both. The spectacle above could only exist because the base below refused to be interesting. As we continue this slow drift, letting repetition blur into reassurance, it's worth sitting with that idea that sometimes the most important thing a system can do is keep everything else from becoming urgent. No fireworks, no revelations, just water moving gently around carefully maintained edges. That's Chinampas, and that's boredom, doing its quiet, unappreciated work night after night.
Chinampas exist in a different relationship with time than most things humans build. They do not mark progress in leaps. They do not announce milestones. They simply continue. And in doing so, they quietly reject the idea that time must always move forward in visible, dramatic ways. For the people who worked them, this meant living inside a loop rather than a line. Days repeated, tasks cycled, seasons returned with familiar variations. The goal was not to reach an endpoint, but to keep the loop intact. Breaking the loop through neglect, haste, or overreach was the real danger. This looping sense of time contrasted sharply with the Aztec elite's obsession with calendars, cycles of destruction, and cosmic renewal. On paper, the universe was fragile. In practice, the Chinampas behaved as if tomorrow would look very much like today,
provided someone showed up and did the work. This quiet confidence was not optimism, it was empirical. The system had demonstrated over generations that attention produced results. Panic did not. Rushing did not. Only steady effort mattered. Living within this temporal rhythm shaped expectations. You didn't expect sudden transformation. You expected gradual improvement or gradual decline if you made mistakes. This made the future feel manageable, not controllable, but understandable. Understanding is underrated. It doesn't eliminate risk, but it reduces fear. Chinampas offered that reduction, even if people never named it. They provided a sense that the world responded to care in predictable ways. This predictability also fostered restraint. When you know consequences arrive slowly, you become cautious. You think before acting. You consider how today's shortcut will feel next season. This mindset is hard to cultivate in environments dominated by immediate feedback. Chinampas delayed feedback, not so much that cause and effect disappeared, but enough that impulsive behavior lost its appeal. You couldn't win quickly, you could only lose slowly, and that asymmetry favored patience. The system also resisted being impressed by novelty. New crops could be introduced, but they had to fit the rhythm. New tools could be adopted, but they had to respect water and soil behavior. Anything that disrupted the loop too much was quietly rejected by poor results. This made Chinampas conservative in the best sense of the word, not resistant to change, but selective. Changes were absorbed only if they proved compatible over time. Flashy ideas with short-term gains faded naturally. Modern observers sometimes mistake this selectivity for stagnation, but stagnation implies absence of motion. Chinampas were always in motion, just not the kind that attracts attention. Their motion was cyclical: maintenance, growth, harvest, repair, repeat. A choreography designed to minimize surprises. This choreography also had social implications. People learned to value reliability over charisma. Someone who showed up consistently mattered more than someone with big ideas. Leadership, where it existed, was practical rather than visionary. This didn't eliminate hierarchy or conflict, it just grounded them in daily reality. Grand plans still required alignment with water depth and soil stability. No decree could override those constraints. When external powers ignored this, consequences followed, slowly, relentlessly. The system did not rebel, it simply produced less. The refusal to be impressed became a form of resistance. Over time, this refusal shaped landscapes that outlasted ideologies. Chinampas didn't argue with colonizers. They didn't adapt to modernity on command. They simply continued where conditions allowed and faded where they did not. This fading is often misread as failure, but from the system's perspective, it is coherence. It works when its requirements are met. It does not when they aren't. No drama, no negotiation. For those who lived with Chinampas, this honesty was a kind of comfort. You knew what was expected of you. You knew what the land would give in return. The relationship was clear. As we let time stretch here, matching the slow pulse of these gardens, it becomes easier to see why they never became symbols of progress or power. They were symbols of continuity, of the unglamorous work required to keep life predictable enough for everything else to flourish. And predictability, though rarely celebrated, is one of the most valuable resources any society can have. Chinampas offered it freely, as long as people were willing to meet them at their pace. Chapter 13. Continuity without applause. By Chapter 13, nothing dramatic should be happening, and that, in a way, is the point. Chinampas do not build toward climaxes. They do not escalate. They settle. They repeat. They persist. If you are waiting for a twist, The system gently suggests you stop waiting and go check the canal edges instead. Continuity for the people living with Chinampas was not abstract. It was visible every morning. The beds were still there. The water was still behaving. The plants were still doing what plants do when not panicked. This reliability became so normal that it faded into the background of consciousness. And when something fades into the background, it stops being credited. Histories of the Aztec world often focus on moments of rupture, conquest, collapse, ceremony. These moments are loud, sharp, and narratively convenient. Chinampas existed before, during, and after them, which makes them inconvenient. They refuse to fit neatly into before and after frameworks. This refusal is important. It reminds us that most human life unfolds in stretches of time where nothing decisive happens. People wake up, they work, they eat, they sleep, they repeat. Systems that support this rhythm are rarely noticed unless they fail. Chinampas specialized in not failing loudly. This made them adaptable across regimes. When tribute systems changed, the gardens adjusted. When crops shifted, planting cycles adapted. When political centers moved, Chinampas stayed where the water was. They were loyal to geography, not authority. This geographical loyalty is one reason they survived conquest better than many institutions. You could dismantle a temple, you could outlaw rituals, you could rename cities, but water, soil, and habit are harder to erase. Colonial administrators might impose new land categories, but Chinampa beds didn't care what they were called. They cared whether canal walls held, whether water levels stayed stable, whether someone showed up to maintain them. This indifference created a strange asymmetry. Power changed hands loudly. Labor continued quietly. The gardens watched empires rearrange themselves while remaining fundamentally the same. There is something deeply unheroic about this. Chinampas do not resist dramatically. They do not symbolize rebellion. They do not stand as monuments to identity. They simply persist. And persistence, historically, is often misunderstood as passivity. But persistence requires effort, constant effort, effort so routine that it looks effortless from the outside. This illusion makes continuity seem automatic, which invites neglect. Neglect, again, is how quiet systems are endangered, not by enemies, but by indifference. Throughout their long history, Chinampas were most vulnerable when people assumed they would take care of themselves. They never did. They always required hands, eyes, and time. This requirement tied people to place. You could not leave easily without consequences. Land abandonment led to rapid decay. Canals silted, beds collapsed. Rebuilding was possible, but costly. Staying was easier than leaving, which anchored communities physically and socially.
This anchoring had ripple effects. Kinship networks stabilized, knowledge accumulated locally. Innovation was cautious and context-specific. The system favored people who committed rather than those who moved on quickly. In a world where mobility increasingly defines success, Chinampas represent an alternative value system, one where staying put and paying attention mattered more than expanding horizons. This does not mean life was idyllic. It means expectations were shaped differently. Progress was measured in maintenance completed, not territory acquired. Success was measured in continuity, not novelty. That mindset rarely leaves written records. It lives in routines, not texts, which is why historians often have to reconstruct it indirectly from landscapes rather than documents. The landscapes, however, are clear. Rectangular beds, straight canals, repeated patterns stretching across what were once vast wetlands, evidence of human intention expressed through restraint. No excess ornamentation, no dramatic variation, just consistency.
This consistency made Chinampas legible to those who knew how to read them. A well-maintained bed signaled competence. Clear water signaled care. These were social signals embedded in the environment itself. Failure was also visible, though quietly so. Eroded edges, cloudy canals, uneven growth. These signs spoke without words. They prompted action, not blame. This absence of blame culture is another underappreciated feature. When systems fail slowly, there is time to correct without assigning fault. Chinampas encouraged problem-solving over punishment. That doesn't mean conflict didn't exist. It means conflict often focused on solutions rather than spectacle. Again, boring. Again, effective. As we let this chapter drift to a close, it's worth sitting with the idea that Chinampas never asked to be remembered. They never tried to define an era. They were content to support one. Their legacy is not a story with a beginning, middle, and end. It is a background hum, a steady presence, a reminder that history is held together by people doing ordinary things correctly, over and over again, without expecting recognition. And that, perhaps, is the most difficult kind of achievement for us to appreciate, especially at night when everything loud finally fades and only the quiet systems remain. Chapter 14. When silence becomes a requirement. By now, it should be clear that Chinampas were not merely tolerant of quiet, they required it. Not as a spiritual ideal, not as a moral preference, but as a functional condition. Noise, haste, and disruption were not abstract annoyances, they had consequences. Water reacts to movement, soil reacts to disturbance, plants respond to stress in slow, cumulative ways. In a Chinampa system, these reactions stacked. A little turbulence every day became erosion. A few careless paddles became collapsed edges. The system didn't punish mistakes immediately, it remembered them. This memory is what made silence practical. Canoes moved slowly, not because people lacked strength, but because strength produced waves. Waves undercut retaining walls. Retaining walls failed gradually, and when they failed, repair cost more time than careful movement ever would have. So silence became a skill, paddling smoothly, placing tools gently, stepping carefully. These were not aesthetic choices, they were maintenance strategies. Children learned this early, not through lectures, but through correction. Splash once, and someone would look at you. Splash twice, and you'd be fixing something. No shouting required. The system itself delivered feedback. This feedback loop extended beyond sound. Visual clutter mattered. Overcrowding mattered. Too many people on a narrow canal caused congestion, turbulence, and distraction. Work schedules adapted accordingly. Tasks were staggered. Routes were informal but understood. Again, boring. Again, effective. Silence also shaped social behavior. Arguments were inconvenient on the water. Gestures replaced words. Coordination relied on familiarity rather than instruction. People who worked together regularly developed shared rhythms, which reduced the need for communication altogether. This kind of tacit coordination is fragile. It takes time to build and is easily disrupted by turnover, which is another reason Chinampa communities valued stability. Newcomers had to learn the rhythms. Until they did, they were liabilities. This didn't mean outsiders were excluded. It meant integration was slow. You didn't get trusted immediately. You earned trust by not disturbing anything. Trust in this context was less about honesty and more about predictability. Could you move without making waves? Could you perform tasks without introducing chaos? Could you notice when something was slightly off? Silence trained attention. Without constant noise, small changes stood out. A shift in watercolor, a new plant growth pattern, an unfamiliar smell.
These sensory cues were easier to detect in a calm environment. This heightened awareness made Chinampa work almost meditative, though no one would have described it that way. The focus was practical, not spiritual, but the effect was similar. The mind slowed to match the environment. Slowness, in turn, reduced error, which reduced the need for correction, which preserved silence, a self-reinforcing loop. This loop extended into the broader urban environment of Tenochtitlan. The city's canals were busy, but they followed rules shaped by Chinampa logic. Traffic flowed because people anticipated each other's movements. Loud disruptions were rare, not because of law enforcement, but because they were impractical. When Spanish observers commented on the orderliness of the canals, they often attributed it to discipline or fear. They missed the deeper explanation. Order emerged because disorder was inefficient. This misunderstanding repeated itself in later centuries. Modern interventions often failed because they ignored the system's need for calm. Mechanized dredging, straightened canals, increased boat traffic, all introduced turbulence the system was not designed to absorb. The result was degradation, followed by confusion about why the primitive system wasn't keeping up. The answer was simple: conditions had changed. Chinampas were not fragile, they were specific. They worked beautifully within certain parameters and poorly outside them. Silence was one of those parameters. This specificity is often misinterpreted as limitation. In reality, it is clarity. A system that tells you exactly how it must be treated is easier to maintain than one that pretends to tolerate anything. As we continue drifting through this very quiet chapter, it becomes easier to appreciate silence not as absence, but as presence, a requirement, a tool, a form of labor in its own right. Silence took effort. It had to be practiced, maintained, protected, and like everything else in the Chinampa world, it paid dividends only over time. Nothing dramatic happened when people stayed quiet, and that, once again, is how you knew things were working. Chapter 15. Maintenance as a moral position.
At some point, maintenance stops being just a task and starts looking suspiciously like a worldview. Chinampas cross that line very calmly. No speeches, no declarations, just a quiet insistence that things worth having are things worth tending, repeatedly, without applause. This insistence shaped behavior in ways that feel almost moral, even if no one framed them that way. You didn't neglect a canal edge because neglect had consequences. You didn't rush a repair because haste created more work later. Over time, these practical decisions hardened into expectations about how a person ought to behave. Good people in this context were not visionary, they were reliable. They showed up, they noticed small problems and fixed them early. They did not leave things worse than they found them. These were not heroic virtues, they were maintenance virtues. Maintenance also blurred the line between individual responsibility and collective survival. One neglected bed could destabilize adjacent canals. One careless worker could create extra labor for others. The system quietly enforced accountability without needing punishment. This kind of accountability is uncomfortable for cultures that prefer clear rules and dramatic enforcement. Chinampas offered neither. They offered consequences instead. Slow, cumulative, unavoidable consequences. You could ignore them for a while. You could pretend nothing was wrong, but eventually water would pool where it shouldn't, soil would slough off, plants would weaken. The system did not argue, it simply responded. This response taught restraint better than any law. It wasn't about obedience, it was about understanding cause and effect well enough to avoid unnecessary suffering. Maintenance became a form of foresight. Foresight, like everything else here, was practical. No one needed to imagine distant futures. You only had to imagine next season, or the season after that. The horizon was close, but stable. This closeness shaped ambition. People still wanted better yields, healthier plants, easier work.
but improvement was incremental. You adjusted compost ratios. You reinforced edges more carefully. You experimented cautiously. Failure, when it happened, was instructive rather than catastrophic. You learned what didn't work. You repaired. You moved on. The system allowed for mistakes as long as they were addressed. This tolerance made Chinampa communities surprisingly resilient emotionally. When nothing hinges on a single success, anxiety has less room to grow. There was pressure, certainly, but it was distributed, not concentrated. Contrast this with systems built on singular moments, a harvest festival that must succeed, a flood control structure that must not fail. Those systems generate tension. Chinampas diffused it. Diffused tension leads to diffused power. No single individual controlled the system. Expertise was shared. Knowledge circulated informally. Authority came from experience rather than position. This didn't eliminate hierarchy, but it softened it. Leaders still existed, but they were constrained by practical realities. You couldn't command water to behave differently. You couldn't decree soil stability. You had to work with what was there. This constraint made leadership quieter, less theatrical, more embedded in daily labor. The most respected people were often those who had spent the most time maintaining things. Maintenance also shaped memory. What was remembered were methods, not moments, techniques passed down, warnings about certain spots, stories about what happens if you skip a step. Memory lived in instruction, not narrative. This kind of memory doesn't translate well into chronicles. It doesn't produce dramatic arcs, which is why it often disappears from history books. But it doesn't disappear from landscapes. Even centuries later, traces of Chinampa logic remain visible where water still flows and beds still hold. The moral position encoded in maintenance persists even when the culture that articulated it has changed. That position is simple. Care is not optional. Stability is not automatic. And boredom, when it accompanies attention, is a sign that things are being done correctly. As this chapter settles into its own quiet rhythm, it becomes clear that Chinampas were not just a way to grow food. They were a way to live without constantly testing the limits of disaster. They asked very little, really. Just patience, just consistency, just the willingness to do the same small things well, over and over again, and to find meaning in that repetition. Not glamorous, not memorable, but remarkably effective. Chapter 16. The Long Afterlife of Quiet Systems. Chinampas did not end when the Aztec world ended. They faded, thinned, adapted, and persisted, which is exactly how they were designed to behave. Systems built on noise collapse dramatically. Systems built on quiet simply become harder to notice. After conquest, the wetlands changed. Canals were drained. Water levels altered. Urban priorities shifted. And yet, in pockets where water still lingered and people still worked carefully, Chinampas continued, not as symbols of resistance, not as relics, just as gardens. This continuation confused outside observers. If a system belongs to a defeated culture, shouldn't it disappear? Chinampas refused to perform that narrative. They didn't announce loyalty to the past. They functioned in the present. Spanish authorities often underestimated them. They were more interested in dry land agriculture, livestock, and straight roads. Wetlands seemed inconvenient, messy, unproductive. So Chinampas were neglected rather than destroyed. Neglect is gentler than destruction, but over time it is just as effective. Water management deteriorated. Urban expansion encroached. Pollution accumulated. The conditions Chinampas required were eroded quietly. Still, fragments survived, particularly in places like Xochimilco, where geography and tradition aligned just enough to keep the system breathing. What survives today is often presented as heritage or tourism, colorful boats, decorative canals, aesthetic echoes. But beneath the surface, the old logic still applies. Where maintenance continues, productivity is possible. When noise increases, water quality declines. Where tension falters, beds collapse. The system did not argue, it simply responded. This response taught restraint better than any law. It wasn't about obedience, it was about understanding cause and effect well enough to avoid unnecessary suffering. Maintenance became a form of foresight. Foresight, like everything else here, was practical. No one needed to imagine distant futures. You only had to imagine next season, or the season after that. The horizon was close, but stable. This closeness shaped ambition. People still wanted better yields, healthier plants, easier work, but improvement was incremental. You adjusted compost ratios, you reinforced edges more carefully, you experimented cautiously. Failure, when it happened, was instructive rather than catastrophic. You learned what didn't work, you repaired, you moved on. The system allowed for mistakes as long as they were addressed. This tolerance made Chinampa communities surprisingly resilient emotionally. When nothing hinges on a single success, anxiety has less room to grow. There was pressure, certainly, but it was distributed, not concentrated. Contrast this with systems built on singular moments, a harvest festival that must succeed, a flood control structure that must not fail. Those systems generate tension. Chinampas diffused it. Diffused tension leads to diffused power. No single individual controlled the system. Expertise was shared, knowledge circulated informally. Authority came from experience rather than position. This didn't eliminate hierarchy, but it softened it. Leaders still existed, but they were constrained by practical realities. You couldn't command water to behave differently. You couldn't decree soil stability. You had to work with what was there. This constraint made leadership quieter, less theatrical, more embedded in daily labor. The most respected people were often those who had spent the most time maintaining things. Maintenance also shaped memory. What was remembered were methods, not moments, techniques passed down, warnings about certain spots, stories about what happens if you skip a step. Memory lived in instruction, not narrative. This kind of memory doesn't translate well into chronicles. It doesn't produce dramatic arcs, which is why it often disappears from history books. But it doesn't disappear from landscapes. Even centuries later, traces of Chinampa logic remain visible where water still flows and beds still hold. The moral position encoded in maintenance persists even when the culture that articulated it has changed. That position is simple. Care is not optional. Stability is not automatic. And boredom, when it accompanies attention, is a sign that things are being done correctly. As this chapter settles into its own quiet rhythm, it becomes clear that Chinampas were not just a way to grow food, they were a way to live without constantly testing the limits of disaster. They asked very little, really. Just patience, just consistency, just the willingness to do the same small things well, over and over again, and to find.
This fragility gives Chinampas their long afterlife. They linger as long as someone remembers how to be quiet with water. When that memory fades, the system does too. Yet even in fading, Chinampas leave marks. Canal outlines visible in aerial photographs, soil patterns detectable beneath modern construction. The land remembers, even when people forget. Historians sometimes call this a palimpsest, layers written over but not erased. Chinampas are a wetland palimpsest. Their logic still shapes drainage patterns, vegetation, and urban form. This quiet persistence challenges our usual sense of historical endings. Empires fall, systems collapse, but some things simply diminish. They slide into the background, they wait, and sometimes they return. In recent decades, interest in sustainable agriculture has drawn renewed attention to Chinampas, again often as ideas rather than practices. But a few people, quietly, are doing the work, dredging canals, repairing beds, learning the rhythms again. The system responds, as it always has, with productivity, with stability, with an almost stubborn refusal to be impressed by our rediscovery.
As this chapter drifts toward its end, it becomes clear that Chinampas never needed to be remembered to survive. They only needed to be used. Their afterlife is not a story of resurrection. It is a story of continuity interrupted and resumed, quietly, slowly, without ceremony. And in that long, subdued persistence, they offer one final lesson, that the things which last the longest are often the things that make the least noise while doing it. Chapter 17, Learning to Move at the System's Pace. By now, the Chinampa system has made one thing very clear. It sets the pace. Humans either adjust to it or they exhaust themselves trying to force something faster. Most eventually learn, not through instruction, but through friction, through wasted effort, through repairs that didn't need to happen. Learning the pace was not intuitive. People arrived with energy, ideas, urgency. The system responded by absorbing that urgency and converting it into extra work. Paddle too fast, fix the edge later. Plant too densely, thin the beds next season. Rush composting, deal with imbalance months down the line. The system never said no. It said, all right, and then handed you the consequences. This made experiential rather than theoretical. You didn't memorize rules, you internalized tempo. The correct speed revealed itself as the one that didn't create future problems. This tempo extended beyond physical movement. Planning happened slowly. Decisions were conservative. Changes were tested in small patches before being adopted widely. Nothing was rolled out universally without proof that it wouldn't destabilize adjacent areas. This incrementalism frustrated outsiders, especially administrators and reformers who wanted immediate results. Chinampas did not respond well to timelines. They responded to observation. When external pressure demanded more output, the system complied briefly and then declined. Overworked beds needed recovery. Neglected maintenance accumulated. Productivity dropped, not as punishment, but as physics. These declines were often misinterpreted as inefficiency, but they were signals, warnings that the pace had been exceeded. People who stayed long enough learned to read these signals. They learned when to pause, when to let a bed rest, when to invest time now to save time later. This learning process fostered humility, not the performative kind, the practical kind. You stopped assuming you knew better than water and soil. You adjusted your expectations. Humility in this context was not philosophical, it was economical. Arrogance cost labor. Attention saved it. This recalibration also affected how people related to each other. Bragging about speed or output made little sense when those traits often led to extra maintenance later. What mattered was smoothness, consistency, a kind of quiet competence. People noticed who could work all day without causing disturbances, who left things slightly better than they found them, who anticipated issues before they became visible. Reputation grew from this, not flashy reputations, subtle ones. You were known as someone whose section never caused trouble, whose water stayed clear, whose beds held their shape. These reputations mattered more than formal titles. They influenced cooperation, trust, the willingness of others to share space and resources. This social fabric was woven from tempo alignment. When people moved at similar speeds, collaboration was easy. When someone moved faster or slower, friction emerged. Friction didn't explode into conflict. It manifested as inefficiency, extra work, quiet resentment. Most people adjusted before it reached that point. In this way, Chinampas trained people socially as much as agriculturally. They taught synchronization, not through commands, but through shared constraints. This synchronization extended across generations. Children learned not just tasks, but rhythms. They absorbed the pace by watching, imitating, correcting. No one explained why you moved a certain way, you just did. Over time, this created a culture attuned to gradualism. Big changes were viewed skeptically.
Small improvements were celebrated quietly. Stability was prized. This cultural imprint lingered even as external conditions changed. Even when Chinampas declined, the habits of careful pacing persisted in other forms of work, in crafts, in trade, in household management. It's difficult to trace these influences precisely. They don't leave clean records, but they show up in patterns of behavior, in preferences for incremental improvement over radical overhaul. As we ease into the end of this chapter, it becomes clear that Chinampas never needed to be remembered to survive. They only needed to be used. Their afterlife is not a story of resurrection. It is a story of continuity interrupted and resumed, quietly, slowly, without ceremony. And in that long, subdued persistence, they offer one final lesson, that the things which last the longest are often the things that make the least noise while doing it. Chapter 18. Learning to move at the system's pace. By now, the Chinampa system has made one thing very clear. It sets the pace. Humans either adjust to it or they exhaust themselves trying to force something faster. Most eventually learn, not through instruction, but through friction, through wasted effort, through repairs that didn't need to happen. Learning the pace was not intuitive. People arrived with energy, ideas, urgency. The system responded by absorbing that urgency and converting it into extra work. Paddle too fast? Fix the edge later. Plant too densely? Thin the beds next season. Rush composting? Deal with imbalance months down the line. The system never said no. It said, all right, and then handed you the consequences. This made experiential rather than theoretical. You didn't memorize rules, you internalized tempo. The correct speed revealed itself as the one that didn't create future problems. This tempo extended beyond physical movement. Planning happened slowly. Decisions were conservative. Changes were tested in small patches before being adopted widely. Nothing was rolled out universally without proof that it wouldn't destabilize adjacent areas. This incrementalism frustrated outsiders, especially administrators and reformers who wanted immediate results. Chinampas did not respond well to timelines. They responded to observation. When external pressure demanded more output, the system complied briefly and then declined. Overworked beds needed recovery. Neglected maintenance accumulated. Productivity dropped, not as punishment, but as physics. These declines were often misinterpreted as inefficiency, but they were signals, warnings that the pace had been exceeded. People who stayed long enough learned to read these signals. They learned when to pause, when to let a bed rest, when to invest time now to save time later. This learning process fostered humility, not the performative kind, the practical kind. You stopped assuming you knew better than water and soil. You adjusted your expectations. Humility in this context was not philosophical, it was economical. Arrogance cost labor. Attention saved it. This recalibration also affected how people related to each other. Bragging about speed or output made little sense when those traits often led to extra maintenance later. What mattered was smoothness, consistency, a kind of quiet competence. People noticed who could work all day without causing disturbances, who left things slightly better than they found them, who anticipated issues before they became visible. Reputation grew from this, not flashy reputations, subtle ones. You were known as someone whose section never caused trouble, whose water stayed clear, whose beds held their shape. These reputations mattered more than formal titles. They influenced cooperation, trust, the willingness of others to share space.
Was measured in subtle improvements rather than dramatic achievements. Modern minds, trained to seek novelty, often misread this as stagnation, but stagnation implies wasted potential. Chinampas realized their potential precisely by avoiding unnecessary change. Predictability also shaped emotional life. Anxiety thrives on uncertainty. When the future is legible, anxiety has fewer places to hide. This doesn't eliminate hardship, but it makes it manageable. Even when things went wrong, the range of possible responses was known. You fix what you can, you adapt, you move on. The script was familiar. This familiarity extended to social interactions. Disputes followed predictable patterns. Cooperation followed predictable rhythms. People knew what was expected of them and what they could expect in return. This clarity reduced conflict escalation. When expectations are shared, disagreements rarely spiral. They are addressed within known boundaries. Chinampas reinforced these boundaries quietly. They punished deviation through extra work, not social drama. The system itself became the arbiter. This reduced the need for constant supervision or enforcement. People self-regulated because the consequences were immediate enough to notice and gradual enough to correct. Predictability also enabled planning, not ambitious long-term plans, but practical ones. You knew when certain tasks would be needed. You prepared accordingly. Preparation, again, reduced stress, and reduced stress made work smoother, a virtuous cycle. The emotional tone of this environment was subdued, not joyful, not miserable, steady. This steadiness is difficult to appreciate from the outside because it doesn't register as happiness or success, but it matters. It supports endurance. It allows people to persist through unfavorable conditions without burning out. Burnout requires intensity. Chinampas diluted intensity. They spread effort across time. This dilution is perhaps their most underappreciated feature. They made sustainability feel normal rather than aspirational. As we move through this chapter, letting predictability do its quiet work, it becomes clear that Chinampas were not just agricultural systems, they were emotional infrastructures. They shaped how people related to time, effort, and expectation. They taught that knowing what comes next can be a form of relief, not monotony. And in a world that often feels chaotic, that relief might be one of the most valuable things a system can offer. The water flows, the beds hold. Tomorrow will look much like today. And for the people who lived with Chinampas, that was enough.
Chapter 20. The Unnoticed Success. If Chinampas had failed more often, they might be easier to remember. Failure leaves records, complaints, reforms, dramatic interventions. Success, especially quiet success, leaves very little behind. For long stretches of time, Chinampas simply worked. Food appeared in markets. Households ate regularly. Urban populations stayed fed. No one wrote urgently about this because urgency was unnecessary. This is the paradox of unnoticed success. When a system functions reliably, it disappears into normality. It becomes assumed, expected, invisible. Aztec elites certainly noticed when food did not arrive. They noticed shortages. They noticed disruption. But when supply was steady, attention drifted elsewhere, toward ritual, toward politics, toward war. Chinampas did not demand attention, and so they rarely received it. This lack of attention was not neglect, it was trust. Trust that the system would continue doing what it had always done. Trust that daily labor, repeated quietly, would produce results. This trust allowed energy to be spent elsewhere. And because Chinampas were decentralized, this trust was distributed. There was no single point of failure, no central authority whose collapse would halt production. Thousands of small decisions and actions created resilience. Resilience, again, does not announce itself. It reveals itself only when tested. And Chinampas passed their tests slowly, over centuries, without spectacle. This longevity creates a strange challenge for historians. How do you emphasize the importance of something that didn't cause crises? How do you dramatize continuity? Often, you don't. You move past it.
You focus on louder systems, on emperors and battles and dates. But underneath those narratives, Chinampas remained, quietly underwriting them. Without steady food production, ceremonies would have faltered, armies would have starved, cities would have emptied. In this sense, Chinampas were not background scenery, they were load-bearing walls. Load-bearing structures are rarely decorated. They are hidden behind surfaces. They do not invite admiration. They invite reliance. Reliance breeds complacency, but also stability. As long as the walls hold, you don't think about them. The problem arises when conditions change and the walls are altered without understanding their function. That is when unnoticed success becomes noticed failure. Modern disruptions exposed this. Drainage projects, pollution, urban sprawl, all interfered with the quiet mechanisms that had kept Chinampas productive. When yields declined, confusion followed. Why wasn't this ancient system still working? The answer, as always, was maintenance, or the lack of it. The system had not stopped being effective, it had stopped being allowed to function. This distinction matters. It shifts blame away from the system and toward conditions imposed upon it. Chinampas were never obsolete, they were sidelined. And even then, traces of their success remain visible in the fertility of soils long after abandonment, in the outlines of canals that still influence water flow, in the stubborn productivity of plots that continue to be worked. This lingering success challenges linear narratives of progress. It suggests that some solutions are not replaced because they are inferior, but because they are inconvenient. Inconvenient because they require time, because they require patience, because they require silence. As this chapter settles, it becomes clear that Chinampas achieved something rare. They solved a problem so effectively that it stopped being perceived as a problem at all. Feeding a city, quietly, continuously, without demanding recognition. That is the kind of success that rarely earns monuments, but it earns endurance. And as we drift here, letting the idea of unnoticed success sink in, it becomes easier to appreciate systems that ask little of us except attention and reward that attention by making the rest of life feel manageable. No applause, no headlines, just another day where things work and no one has to think too hard about why, which for a system designed to support sleep as much as sustenance feels exactly right. Chapter 21. Drifting past the need for meaning. By the time a system has worked for long enough, people stop asking what it means. Chinampas reached that point early. They did not require justification. They did not invite interpretation. They simply existed, and that existence was enough. Meaning is usually assigned where uncertainty lives. When outcomes are unclear, humans reach for explanation, symbolism, purpose, narratives that make instability feel intentional. Chinampas offered very little uncertainty, and so very little meaning-making was required. You did not need to believe in Chinampas. You did not need to feel inspired by them. You only needed to maintain them. The relationship was transactional in the calmest possible way. This absence of symbolic weight is unusual for something so central to daily life. Food systems often become sacred, politicized, or mythologized. Chinampas remained stubbornly practical. They existed alongside ritual, but they were not ritualized themselves. Ceremonies happened because food was available, not to make food available. This order matters. It kept belief downstream from labor, not the other way around. As a result, Chinampas absorbed changes in belief without disruption. Gods changed, rulers changed, explanations for why the world worked shifted dramatically. The gardens did not notice. This indifference can feel unsettling to modern sensibilities. We often want systems to align with values, identities, or ideologies. Chinampas aligned only with physics and biology. That alignment freed people from existential pressure. You did not need to feel morally worthy to harvest food. You needed to show up and do the work. This clarity reduced anxiety. When survival is tied to effort rather than belief, fear loses some of its power. You might worry about weather, you might worry about labor, but you did not worry about meaning. Meaning is heavy. Chinampas kept life light by not asking for it. This lightness extended to how people thought about legacy. You didn't expect to be remembered. You expected the beds to hold. Your contribution was anonymous by design. Anonymous, again, is often mistaken for insignificance, but anonymous work is what allows continuity. When systems depend on named individuals, they become fragile. Chinampas depended on replacement. Anyone could step in, learn the rhythm, and continue. No heroic lineage required. This made death less disruptive. When someone was gone, work redistributed. The system absorbed loss quietly, as it absorbed everything else.
This absorption softened grief. Loss was real, but life did not shatter around it. The garden still needed attention, and that attention provided structure when emotion threatened to overwhelm. There is a quiet mercy in that. As time passed, people living with Chinampas learned to not overthink their place in history. They lived inside continuity, not narrative. Their days were connected more by repetition than by story. Historians struggle with this. It leaves little to quote, few dramatic turning points, just layers of maintained earth. But those layers tell a different kind of story, one about lives spent not chasing meaning, but sustaining conditions in which meaning could emerge elsewhere. Temples, markets, homes, relationships, all rested on the assumption that food would be there tomorrow. Chinampas made that assumption reasonable. As we ease through this chapter, letting go of the urge to extract lessons or metaphors, it becomes clear that perhaps the most radical thing about Chinampas was their refusal to explain themselves. They didn't promise fulfillment, they didn't symbolize harmony, they didn't claim wisdom. They worked. And sometimes, drifting quietly through a system that works without commentary, that does not ask to be understood or admired, is the most restful experience history can offer. No meaning required, just water, soil, patience, and another day unfolding exactly as expected. Chapter 22, The Rhythm of Repetition. One of the most understated aspects of Chinampa life was repetition. Not the kind of repetition that bores you after a minute, but the steady, predictable cycle that extends across days, seasons, and years. Repetition was not merely habit, it was infrastructure. The same gestures performed over and over reinforced the land, the laborers, and the system itself. Planting a seed in precisely the right spot, layering soil with care, checking water flow, straightening a canal edge. Each action mattered less individually than cumulatively. The system rewarded consistency, not flash. It ignored the dramatic and the flamboyant, and in doing so, it offered calm in exchange. Repetition also shaped perception of time. Days folded into each other, seasons returned. Life became a slow, deliberate rhythm. There were no sudden accelerations or decelerations. Nothing demanded instant attention. Instead, the mind relaxed into cadence. You moved, the system responded. You adjusted, and the next day arrived much like the last. This rhythm trained observation. In a world where movement is predictable, small deviations become obvious. A sagging edge, murky water, or uneven plant growth signaled problems early, long before disaster struck. The human eye, calibrated to the slow pulse of routine, became an early warning system. Routine also created psychological safety. Laborers could trust that effort would pay off, not in spectacular bursts, but steadily. You didn't gamble on results, you relied on process. Trust in the system replaced constant worry. The rhythm extended socially. Canoes moved in staggered lines to avoid collisions. Work schedules adjusted naturally.
Communication relied on gestures and timing rather than arguments. People learned to anticipate one another's movements. Harmony emerged quietly from shared patterns, not edicts. Even mistakes were absorbed into rhythm. Misplaced soil, slightly damaged edges, or water miscalculations weren't crises. They were prompts to repeat carefully, learn, and correct. The system rewarded persistence over genius. Over time, laborers internalized this rhythm so completely that their movements became nearly automatic. Repetition also reinforced legacy. Children observing elders absorbed timing and technique through imitation rather than instruction. Knowledge was transmitted quietly through daily participation. No lectures required, no manuals, just doing the work repeatedly until it became second nature. In this sense, the rhythm of repetition was a teacher, patient, unassuming, unforgiving of shortcuts, and yet endlessly generous for those willing to synchronize with it. It demanded neither ambition nor brilliance, only presence and care. As we settle into this chapter's gentle pulse, it becomes clear that rhythm was the heart of Chinampas, not spectacle, not hierarchy, not conquest, just the quiet, reliable beat of hands, soil, and water moving together in a pattern that ensured survival. The rhythm, much like sleep, does not announce itself. You notice it only when you align with it, and when you do, everything else, worry, haste, drama, slows down. And for anyone drifting through these quiet gardens, that slowing is exactly the gift Chinampas were designed to give.